Maybe one day I'll be an astronaut. Maybe. As I sat there on my son's bed late that night, I heard him in the kind of limitless ambition that I wish I could have held on to just a few years longer into my adult life. Tucked in his bed as tight as humanly possible, he stared unblinkingly at the glow-in-the-dark plastic stars that enveloped the ceiling above him. I tousled his hair while setting the book we had started reading on his nightstand. And maybe one day we'll get through a chapter in this book. He shifted his head in my direction, giving me a look that indicated he was about to lay down some hard facts. Astronauts never read, Papa. They're too busy flying through space. You don't think they need something to do while they're flying through space? He shook his head vigorously while readjusting his gaze back towards the ceiling. They fly really big spaceships. If they don't pay attention, they'll hit an asteroid and blow up. I couldn't argue with his logic, so I retreated into a soft chuckle as I stood up beside his bed. You win this round, kiddo. Those moments were always special for me as a father. On a normal day, Kevin would rarely speak. Granted, he was 6 and probably a little shy. I think a lot of it was that he was just too busy running around the house at full speed to stop and talk. It was as if God realized he made me too much of a conversationalist and wanted to see what the universe would be like. When it came to the topic of space exploration, though, everything was flipped. He could sit perfectly still and talk about the various planets in our solar system and how each one was super cool in their own way. If you didn't know, Neptune only has aquatic life in the form of giant turtles. Mars has alien species that come to visit Earth unnoticed all the time, and Jupiter's red spot is actually made out of spaghetti sauce. Imagination was never short in supply with him, so it was always a treat just letting him ramble on about the universe and all of its secrets. Good night, Kev. Night, Papa. Turning off the lamp beside his bed, Kevin was immediately bathed in the sharp green hue of the stars above. Maybe it was the fact that his room was unusually dark, being partially underground, but those stars illuminated his entire being with the intensity of a ton of minuscule green flashlights. It was a sight I'd gotten used to seeing ever since we put the stars up a couple years back, and one that didn't bother him any, but still, it slightly unsettled me. On this particular night, I decided to spend my remaining hours awake catching up on some work. I was a recruiter at the time for an outreach program that focused on troubled teens, which on my end basically equated to a ton of paperwork and lots of phone calls. I mean, sure, I went to school to be an astronomer, and Kevin always liked hearing what I could contribute to our space conversations, but this recruiter job allowed me to be a stay-at-home dad after his mom left us, so I try not to complain. It had started to rain outside, with the rumble of distant thunder gently rattling the frame of our old country house. From a single glance, I could tell a pretty significant storm was heading our way, and despite the fact we lived in Tornado Alley, Kevin's room provided an appropriate amount of shelter, so I never spent too much time panicking in the face of Mother Nature. I was prepared to head into his room to hunker down for the storm anyway when he called out, "Papa, a shooting star!" Oh, brother, I must have thought. That was probably the 3rd shooting star that he had seen in the last week alone. Kevin had always been the type to do everything in his power to stay awake a little longer than his bedtime, and calling out shooting stars was his go-to move. I had never taken the bait before, but because I needed to go into his room anyway, this was the night I finally decided to acknowledge his sighting. I opened the door and immediately began looking for a good spot to camp out for the night. Buddy, I'm sure it was just lightning playing tricks on you. Try and go to sleep, okay? I need to be in here to work until the storm blows over. No, not out there. In here. His clarification was of lesser importance to the plug-in that I had just found to charge my laptop. What do you mean, buddy? The shooting star, it's over there. He was pointing at one of the bigger stars on his ceiling. It was glowing as bright as ever, but sitting completely still. I sighed and gave him that classic parenting look that said, I know what you're doing. Stop playing around, Kev. Go to sleep and tomorrow... No, really, Papa, just watch. That time, I must have sighed at an audible level because Kevin immediately transitioned into begging mode. I put my laptop on the floor beside me and looked up at the star. As it was before, the star stayed in place, casting its green glow directly below him. I kept my gaze affixed on it for what felt like minutes, but it never seemed to. Something moved out of the corner of my eye. More shooting stars, Papa, I told you. In the opposite quadrant of the room, one of the other stars had begun to slowly move towards the center of the ceiling. It never changed its speed or direction. It was as if the star knew exactly where it wanted to be. Once it reached its destination, the room returned to the stillness from before, as I stared in total disbelief at the plastic universe above me. What? I didn't finish my thought before another star started sliding in its own set direction. And then another. And then another. The rain continued to rhythmically fall. The thunder rumbled far off in the distance, but the stars moved in total silence. Oh, look, Papa! The Big Dipper. I think that's the Big Dipper. I couldn't look away from the ceiling, as if another star decided to move, I would know why it happened. All the hairs on the back of my neck were standing at attention. Yet fascination had also taken a hold of me. Scoot over, Kev. He moved over eagerly to the far side of the bed as I climbed in beside him. I was too large to fit in the bed comfortably and too old to believe that being under the covers protected me from the outside world. Nevertheless, here I was. Kevin was pointing towards one of the clusters of stars. Do you see the Big Dipper too? Looking back up at the ceiling, I realized I was seeing the world from Kevin's perspective. To say the least, the green glow from the stars was intimidating. It was as if they were all looking right at me to make sure I wouldn't miss their next migration. I averted my gaze to look more closely at what Kevin was pointing at. Normally, I took his knowledge of the universe with a grain of salt and instead focused on enjoying his imagination. Only this time, he was right. It was the Big Dipper. The stars had informed a look-alike of the famous constellation. It was identical. The layout, the amount of stars that comprised it, everything. I couldn't find a way to confirm within myself that its presence was intentional. But that's what it felt like. Closer to us, I also noticed another formation. The Little Dipper. It was also identical to its real self, but almost perfectly scaled to match its relation to the Big Dipper. They not only fit their individual criteria for look and position, but also the direction they faced in regards to what season it currently was. I was looking at a replica of the nighttime sky. But what was moving the stars in place? Suddenly I was overcome with a feeling of dread. Sweat began to form on my brow and back as I consciously quieted my breathing despite trying to hide it all from Kevin. The green glow from above started to feel more menacing than mesmerizing. We were being watched. I've never seen so many shooting stars at once, Papa. Kevin was staring in wonderment at the new arrangement above him. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. Hey, bud, let's go stay in my room tonight. But the storm has come. I know, but we need to get. I had turned to pull the covers off of Kevin when my arm brushed up against a hard, invisible object over top of him. And then for a brief moment, it became visible. At all fours, a tall humanoid creature was straddling and looming over Kevin's blanket-wrapped figure. Its eyes were jet black, and its hairless body was covered in a bright white skin, highlighted only by the neon green of the stars above. Staring intently at Kevin, it let out a sharp hiss that dwarfed any of the ambient sounds from the outside storm. Then as quickly as it appeared, it vanished from sight. Kevin didn't scream or say a word, but he had turned a shade of pale that almost mirrored the creature above him. I didn't say anything at first either, but I wasted little time aggressively swatting the air over where the creature was to get it away from my son. The thing had already moved. The last thing I wanted to do was anything other than lay there petrified with Kevin, but I knew that wasn't an option. Cradling him in my arms, I quickly got us out of the bed and fled the room. I'd been living in that house for a few years by that point, but everything about what just happened made our surroundings feel alien. The rooms felt bigger, the hallways seemed longer, and everything that once made that house feel safe was suddenly oppressive. Nevertheless, I pressed on to our storage room. I had a gun safe in there, and at the time, grabbing a gun before fleeing seemed like the best option. Kevin still hadn't said a word, but his mouth was wide open as if he was trying to scream. Paralysis had taken over him. I sat down beside him as I began to frantically fumble the combination of my gun safe at the back of the storage room. My palms were sweating all over the dial, and my hand was trembling to the point that opening the safe was much more of a difficult task than I anticipated. I tried several times to open it, but to no avail. "Come on!" I tried once more. The door still wouldn't budge. After I gave the safe a final punch, I gave up and turned around to grab Kevin and flee, but immediately froze. Floating a good 3 feet off the ground, Kevin hung in place by the middle of his shirt. I couldn't see the creature, but by the height and the way my son was grabbed, it was standing on its 2 hind feet. Kevin's helpless body was then rushed out of the room at an inhuman speed, causing his body to shake around like a rag doll. Kevin never screamed, and the creature moved in complete silence. "No!" I sprinted after it with all my remaining strength I had within me, but I only made it halfway down the hallway to the living room before running into an invisible object. A large, white hand quickly faded into existence around my face. Before I had time to register that it was another one of those creatures, it lifted me off the ground in its grip and then threw me to the floor with incredible force. My head took the initial impact and I was knocked unconscious. A severe headache and some blurry vision were what I awoke to. I probably suffered a concussion, but that was the least of my worries at this point. I didn't get very far in my panic search for Kevin before I realized the front door was open. If he was screaming, I couldn't hear it. Kevin and his kidnappers were long gone. It's been 3 years since that night. 3 years since I've seen my son. The weeks following the encounter, I spent searching everywhere in the nearby area with the help of the local police as well as the police of neighboring towns. I ended up losing my job and I sold my home to move back in with my parents. This has at least allowed me to conduct more independent searches as well as try to find information as what exactly those things were that took my son. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more out there than just the 2 that were in my house. Perhaps even a lot more. You can't see them or hear them unless you make physical contact. That seems to be the only way they like it. Kevin had seen shooting stars for months, which makes me think they were observing him that whole time. Who knows if they would have taken him if I had not blown their cover. As I sit here writing this story for you, I am under the light of hundreds of plastic stars. I put them up in my parents' house on the simple hope that I see one of the stars starting to freely move across the ceiling. Something about those stars fascinated them like Kevin. Their ability to correctly position the stars had been something that puzzled me deeply. Maybe the creatures aren't from Earth at all. Maybe Kevin is an astronaut now. Maybe.